Hello everybody, and welcome to episode 70 of the Retro Rents Retro Gaming Podcast. This is a long-awaited part one of what is going to be a series of episodes of our recent interview with game designer, writer, audio dramatist, and just amazing personality, Neal Hallford. We had the pleasure of talking to Neal about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and I've done a lot of interviews on this show. Nick and I have done a lot of interviews on this show, and I have to say, this was probably one of our favorites. Neal was just incredible, super generous with his time, which is why we had to split this up. But this really is like the best recap of some of the coolest moments in gaming history. If you're a fan of Betrayal at Krondor, of Planet's Edge, of science fiction, Neal is just an amazing person, amazing character, and Nick and I had so much fun talking to him, and we hope to do so again. So, without further ado, here's episode 70 and our interview with the amazing Neal Hallford.
But I usually get...
Oh, sorry. I forgot how rude Craig is. Yeah, I was just going to roll it because we're talking, so why not?
All right, that sounds fine.
Sorry, yeah.
Did you want to record a start? Did you want to record a formal start here, or?
No, you know what? I can do that in post.
Okay. All right.
Just keep the conversation going and have some fun.
Sure. So where would you like to start?
I'm thinking, let's start at the beginning. One of the things that
that's a really long time ago. I don't know if we cover
a long time ago,
billions of years ago. Okay, so supernovas exploded and created heavy metal. Okay,
all right. We might have to fast forward a bit from there.
Okay,
at least to the dinosaurs when I first roamed the earth. Oh man! Well, one of the things I obviously when Roberta, the amazing Roberta Vaughn from the Classic Gamers Guild, introduced Neal and I to each other. She knew I was a very huge fan of Betrayal at Krondor, and I have been for many years. It's one of those games that I play maybe once every other year or every couple of years. I just love to dig it out and play it because it's one of my favorite games. And so I was really jazzed to get the chance to talk to you. But, one of the things Nick and I love to do, when we get the chance to interview somebody is kind of really do a deep dive. And I knew you did Krondor, but I never knew you were into audio dramas and stuff like that. And I was thinking, Nick, if you want, we could start there. But how'd that come about? How'd you know that was a thing for you back then?
Okay, wow. Okay, so whenever I was in high school, my last year in high school, my best buddy, Ron Bollinger, was working at a microscopic C&W station that was in my hometown called KTOW. And so I would come over and visit with him, and it was kind of a weird little station. The format was, I don't know, inspired by dropping large doses of acid, I think. Because they were in the daytime, they would play really old classic country. So you'd be looking at Patsy Cline and all of those good folks. But then at night they would switch over to radio, and they would become a top 40 radio station playing Casey Kasem and all this weird stuff overnight. Then they would also play whenever because we were in Sand Springs, Oklahoma, which is just outside of Tulsa. So, we're about 7 miles to the west of Tulsa. And so whenever we were an affiliate for the Kansas City Royals. And so they did the Kansas City Royals games. And also whenever the Louisiana Downs were going on for the races, they would cover those. In addition to also being this radio station that played all of the local high school football games. So they would do all the coverage for that stuff. So anyway, it was a very schizophrenic format.
It's a hell of a spread.
Yeah, it was. It was really kind of nuts, though. But I mean, it's an AM radio station.
Sure.
The guy who owned it, Red Graham, had bought it from Roy Clark, because Roy Clark is a Tulsa boy.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say for your audience, because some of your audience might be young enough that they don't know who the hell Roy Clark was.
It's possible.
He was a major country and western recording star, but he was also one of the stars of a television variety show called Hee Haw. But anyway, so anyhow, I would go over there and hang out with my bud Ron Bollinger. And whenever we were getting close to the end of the year, I said, wow, this is really kind of cool. How do you get a gig over here? And Ron said, well, if you talk to the lady who's basically she was sort of like Lonnie Anderson's character on WKRP. Okay. She was like the lady who actually ran the station. We had a program director and we had the owner, but she was the one who knew what was going on. So I talked to Kay, and she said, "Well, why don't you come over and you can intern with Ron, and then you can start doing this stuff after you graduate." So it was like 3 or 4 days after I graduated from high school. Bam! I had a job working as a disc jockey for KTOW.
That's awesome.
And so it was crazy. It was a great gig. I mean, for the time being, it was huge amount of money. I was making more than minimum wage. It was $4.50 an hour.
Hey, if you're making more than minimum wage out of high school, you're doing pretty good.
I was. I mean, it was just a couple of days out of high school, and I had this kind of cake job because I was on the night shift. And so initially, I was just punching commercials in between the regular. So we would play local commercials during these top 40 programs that are coming out of Chicago. Mm-hmm. So I had a kind of cake job. I'm just sitting down there, and in between things, I'd like punch a couple local commercials, and then for another 15 or 20 minutes, I got nothing else to do. So initially, I'm recording, or while I'm working at the radio station, I've got novels sitting there. So I read pretty much the entire Dune series while I was.
Damn.
While I was working at the station in between spots. So anyway, my bud and I really enjoyed it because most of the people who worked in this radio station were kids. So anywhere from between like my age, I was 17 at the time, up to several people who were in their early 20s. We had a handful of codgers that had been there for a long time. So I had an old guy. Oh God, he must have been 50. But he dressed up like Elvis, and he owned his own radio station, owned his own record store over in West Tulsa, and so he would bring in this box full of like 50s rockabilly stuff, and so it was just close enough to us format. So he would play the morning show after me. After I got off work, so I would work from I think midnight until 7 in the morning. I think it was 6 or 7 in the morning, and then he would come on after me. Anyway, but most of the folks who were working for this radio station are kids. We don't know what the hell we're doing. We've had the basic training about what to do and what buttons to push and all this other crazy stuff. But I really genuinely think that the guy who owned the station, his name was Red Graham. Mm-hmm. And I think Red was actually running the station as a tax shelter. Because our ratings, we were this little, we're kind of an odd station. There back in the day, and I don't know if this is still a thing or not, but back in the day, they had what were called clear channel stations. Yep. And so so during the daytime, we would have, we could reach the local town and those areas around us. But at night, they would basically have other channels that would go off air, and we would crank up our signals, and we'd be bouncing signals off of California.
Oh, that's cool.
And so we would crank up the amp or our power at night. And so it was this kind of weird thing is that during the daytime you'd hear us locally, in basically eastern Oklahoma, but at nighttime sometimes we get phone calls from people calling in from California or New Mexico or all these crazy places.
Impressive when you consider the long distance race at that time, which I remember well.
Yeah, and so it was like I can't remember it. It's like 500,000 watts at night or whatever crazy thing it was. Anyway, so this wasn't something that used to happen all the time. Is that we have certain AM stations that would have this, and so, but even with all of that, we were not a station that had gigantic ratings, right. and also by this point we had with this crazy schizophrenic format that we had. I mean, of course, the irony was we had our audience was about as diverse as you could possibly get, and
that's amazing.
What audience we had depended on what time of day we had. It was. So anyhow, we didn't have a lot of stuff to do. For those of us who were working on the night shifts and things like that, we a lot of time sitting around twiddling our thumbs. And punching commercials in between, broadcasters either coming in from Chicago or coming from the Royals games or the Downs. And so sitting right next to our booth was a production studios. Now, when you think about production studios today, it's nothing nearly as fancy as that. But it's still professional recording equipment.
Like a booth and stuff like that.
So it's a booth. The walls are carpeted up all the way around, and so it's wall-to-wall carpeting in this little tiny, probably just a little bit bigger than your average closet, to be honest.
Yeah.
And we've got it was really fancy because we had a Fostex B10 recorder, which is a really high-tech stuff at the time. And we had a DAT recorder, but we didn't get that until fairly late.
I was going to say, this is 84? Wow.
So this is starting 84. Well, this is sort of evolution. We got the B10, I think, at about 85 or 86. But we had, but again, it's still professional. I've got a professional broadcast a mixer, and then of course this was primarily there to record commercials.
Yep.
And record our PSAs and other stuff, and so folks understand is that how things were handled back in the days. You would have what they called a cart, which would by all resemblances would looks like an 8-track cart. If you've ever heard of an 8-track, that's exactly what this was, except it was in a loop. And so you would play it and it would go back, it would be like 30 seconds long or a minute long, and you'd record your stuff on it. So so we had the cart recorders and all that stuff. So anyway, the booth is primarily there just to handle commercials and PSAs and stuff like that. Well, my buddy and I said, whenever we've got these huge amounts of time, whenever there's nothing going on, well, let's mess around in here. And my buddy and I are both. I'm 17, he's 18, and we have another buddy of ours who's the old man at like 22 or something like that. And we started messing around and said, it'd be kind of funny that every the top of the hour we of course had to do the weather report. Okay. So we decided, wouldn't it be really fun to to do something fun with a weather report? And so we'll do the weather report for Sand Springs, Oklahoma, but we'll pretend as though we're broadcasting from some exotic location. And so we're saying, okay, tonight Sand Springs weather broadcast is brought to you from Transylvania, and you'd hear like wolves howling and bats and crazy things like that. We did probably one that would not be nearly as appreciated as we did one from Belfast, and so you hear machine guns and bombs. Back before we things got ironed out in Northern Ireland.
Right? Yeah.
So we were initially started just goofing off and doing stuff like that.
Oh, you guys must have been having a ball.
Oh, we were having a great time. We were having a great time. But I learned so much during the process of doing that because again, we're just messing around. I don't really have any specific deadlines for the stuff that we're doing. I don't have somebody kind of sitting on top of me saying you have to do this. It's just like, okay, let's see what happens with this. And again, our ratings are so low. It's like no one will care if we will care about what we're doing. And so it's not like unless and short of just violating the terms of our FCC contracts, because I had to have, I applied, I got my license from the FCC. So we decided one time Ron and I and our buddy Mark are all sitting around saying, hey, let's do something really fun for Halloween. And we always said, we've got this recording booth, and we were all, of course, grew up and knew all about War of the Worlds and the Orson Welles broadcast.
Oh yeah.
So we said, let's do our own version of that, except it's not going to be about aliens. We're going to base this on a local legend. And so we had our own local legend about a guy called the Bulldog Man.
Mm-hmm.
So we wrote it up this entire script, and the idea was going to be about talking about the myth or the legend of the Bulldog Man. And we got my dad knew the chief of police in town, so I got to get him come in and do an interview. And so we did it kind of this weird format where we were, taking quote unquote calls from the public of people who had seen the Bulldog Man, which is all fiction. It was, all stuff that I'd written for the script. But we fictionalized this whole thing and treated it almost like it was a 2020 special about the legend of the Bulldog Man, and was he real or was he not real, and all this other stuff. And so part of it is towards the end of the program, we have someone calling in and saying, you need to stop talking about all this other stuff because he's real, he's my son, and he knows this is going on.
Oh my God, this is great.
You've got to stop doing this because you're going to make him angry. And so we just go, ha, 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 that's so funny, blah, 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 whatever, these crazy people. But we said, well, this was great fun. We hope you all enjoy your Halloween. And then we do a formal closeout for the show.
Uh-huh.
So then we have Mark, who was supposed to be coming on as the DJ for the next section. And so we go in and we do like 5 or 10 minutes into his show. But while he's talking, he keeps on talking about, I'm hearing something really weird going on. I heard a sound that sounds like broken glass. And I wonder what that was. And so after a couple of seconds, you hear him shout, and then we shut the transmitter down. Now,
so you're literally playing your own version of the War of the Worlds going on.
We did. And so we shut off the transmitter for 10 minutes, which was highly illegal. And so, we had people freaking out and calling us, or are you guys okay? And we're saying, no, it's all right. It was just a show, and whatever. So again, it was not like we didn't have a flood of people. We didn't, cause the kind of panic that was caused by the War of the Worlds program. But we had a handful of people, go, what the hell just happened? Because, again, we did the whole thing of closing out the show and pretending like we were going into normal programming, just like they had done in War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
And so, but anyway, that was fun. But that gave us our first taste at doing audio drama. And so that was not technically part of the show that we would ultimately create, called Uncharted Regions, but that is what basically was my first toe into audio drama. And but the great thing about that process is that it taught me something about producing and working with audio. It taught me about writing for the format. And we followed up in Christmas. Ron wrote a piece called Silent Night, which was not really a Weird Tales kind of thing, but right. We're starting to toe into that sort of region of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then after that, we just kind of said, hey, let's do this on they weren't going to give us a time slot where we could just every week do this. Right. But we talked to the program director, and they said, hey, if you want to occasionally do some more stuff like this, we're totally fine with it, because again, they don't care. But occasionally they'll say, like, here's a time slot where nothing else much is going on, so you can drop this in there if you want. And so we then began the process over the next couple of years And this would be like every couple of months we might do a new episode or and stuff. And so the next episode after Silent Night was the first official Uncharted Regions episode, and that was called Calls Waiting. And this was all, and of course, part of the reason we got interested in all of this stuff was that at around the same time that we were doing this, of course, the early 80s was just kind of an odd period that is not, people don't tend to look at it this way, but this was actually kind of a golden period for radio drama, sort of a second era of radio drama, because this early time period is whenever the Lord of the Rings audio drama
that's right.
dropped. The Hobbit drops. The Star Wars audio drama drops in this time period. And Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And
Wow.
The thing that I was personally the most attracted to, because being a writer and the junior high, particularly in high school, was Ray Bradbury. And so there was a fantastic audio drama series that came in the early 80s, Bradbury, from students up there, and it ended up winning the Peabody, Anna, I believe, who was the producer for that particular series. But really great production, great music, and those are the things that honestly, whenever I heard those, I got really excited about the idea of telling stories with audio, telling stories just with dialogue and sound effects and music. And so that was my guiding star whenever we kicked off the first sort of iteration of Uncharted Regions, is looking at Ray Bradbury and say, let's tell those kind of stories. And obviously Twilight Zone is a huge influence for what we were doing.
Sure. Oh yeah.
But that's of course I'm a child of I'm the same age as Star Trek, right?
Yep.
So I was growing up under Star Trek and Star Wars and Twilight Zone and all of this kind of stuff, and all the classic science fiction stuff that happened in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sort of very deep emotional kinds of science fiction. Obviously, we had a lot of blowing things up science fiction too that was coming down the pike. Star Wars kind of changed the whole track of things there. But I was very much interested in telling deep emotional stories, and so that was sort of how Uncharted Regions.
Sorry.
And so it was, my buddy and my friends, periodically producing these things between 1984 and 1989. So during that period, there were 2 episodes that we wrote, and we had basically kind of sitting on the runway to be produced, but one was called Haven and another one was called Someday Over You. And so we had people. So for Haven, we actually had the cast come in. We had it recorded. Haven was the first time we had at least semi-pro cast involved. Before that, it was like me and my friends, and whoever we could grab to come in and do this kind of thing. But with Haven, we took it up a next notch. We went to the local junior college. We held auditions. And so with Haven, we recorded it, but everything was sitting on a DAT. But there were still some parts for it that I still needed to get people for, but we just never got around to finishing up and finding those people. And so it unfortunately never got finished produced. And so that original recording of at least the main dialogue is still sitting on a DAT tape somewhere in my mother's house in Oklahoma.
Oh, wow.
And so I just would have to find that. First I had to unearth the tape. And the second thing is I had to find a DAT player because they don't really use those anymore. They're still, you can still find them on eBay and such, but and then another episode called Someday Over You was written. We cast it, but we never even got down to the point where it was on tape yet. So anyway, so meanwhile, while all this stuff is going on, I've gone to the University of Oklahoma. I got a degree in radio, television, and film production, which was greatly aided by the fact that by the time I got into the university and I was taking classes, I'd already been working in radio for a couple of years. And
Yeah.
so I had my own recording rig in my house.
Oh,
And
nice.
so a lot of people would have to schedule time to go in and schedule time to go into the lab up there so they could record stuff. Well, I'm sitting in my bedroom.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I'm recording so I've got plenty of time to do this, and I've got a little cassette tape multi-track machine, and so I recorded all of my stuff for them on that cassette tape, as we did for a couple of episodes of Uncharted Regions. So I come out of KTRW, or I come out of OU, and I've got my degree that basically says you know how to do what you already know how to do because you've been doing it radio work. I can sort of consider that is we're just formalizing. You're
just certified now.
I'm just certified. There's a piece of paper that says you know how to do what you know how to do. So I got out of OU. I was fully expecting that I was going to go into a career in probably news radio. Because again, I grew up in Oklahoma. My expectation, my idea back in the day is I was interested in film. I was interested in other things like that. But my assumption with film is that, well, if you want to work in film, you've got to know somebody in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Well,
or live there.
Yeah, or live there. And it's just like I had no interest in moving to Hollywood because I believe about Hollywood what I see on television. Right. And so I don't see anything that really just draws me to live there. And so I'm somebody who my heart belongs to. I should have been born in England. That's who I want to live in a castle on the coast of some Welsh coast or something with big waves crashing and it's raining all the time. That's what makes me happy.
Oh my God, you're a kindred spirit with me.
And so, and my brother and I visited whenever I was about 16, but that's a whole other crazy, insane story. But that's where sort of my heart. So I look at Southern California and it's sunshine and beaches, and this is just not my scene. But like I said, so my expectation is I got my degree in radio, television, and film production. And I figured, well, I'm gonna work in radio. I'm gonna be a radio news guy because I had when I was in high school, I was in charge of the high school magazine. I worked for the yearbook. I did all that stuff. My journalism teacher, she was sort of my mentor, and she promoted me even when I didn't know she was promoting me. And so occasionally I'd get stuff at the high school where, oh, you won this award. And I go, I didn't apply for an award. And it was just her basically taking my materials and sending it out to the state, contests. And so I'd go,
that's awesome.
Yeah. And so, Laura Schaub, I love her to death. We called her Mom Schaub. She was the most amazing lady in the world. I love her to death. And she's a huge reason why I'm a writer. But anyhow, so I get out of OU and I'm planning on trying to find a gig working in the radio industry or in working as either a DJ or in radio news. And I'm looking around, and of course it's but at first I go back to Tulsa with my parents because I don't have a gig, and so I need I'm going to stay with them for a while until I can pick up a job. And I worked for a little while at a direct mail place in Tulsa, and I hated that job. It was the worst. It was just like, and the thing about it was, the person who. Meanwhile, while I'm working at the direct mail place, I get a phone call from a good buddy of mine named Kenneth Mayfield. Now, Ken and I went to junior high together. Ken was an amazing, great artist, and he went to work for Task Force Games. Task Force Games were the maker of a game called Starfleet Battles, which and so if you Star Trek, this was basically a strategic game that let you go starships head to head. It was also, of course, I as much as I loved it for the sort of idea of we're basically fighting starships against each other. this could also be incredibly tedious because the usual game was about 8 hours.
I was going to say, it took forever.
It took forever, and there was so much counting, and it was basically, we sometimes would call it accounting wars, because you would sit down and you're saying, okay, this is how much power I have to give to the phasers and to whatever, and so there was lots of math and other stuff that was just, it did not exactly play to the fantasy of being a starship captain that won the Pope. So, anyway, but Task Force Games were the publishers of Starfleet Battles. And so Ken had actually done some of the covers for some of their modules and some other things for them. Well, Task Force Games got purchased by a company called New World Computing.
Oh, there we go.
New World Computing were the publishers, the makers behind everyone knows it, the Might and Magic.
Might and Magic.
The classic role-playing system, Might and Magic. And so Ken had gone to work for them and became the lead artist at New World Computing. And
I would say that name sounded familiar to me. I was trying to pin it down.
And so Kenny and I have known each other for years. We were in high school, or we were in junior high together first, and then at the high school we formed the first science fiction club at our high school called Avni. And so we've known each other for a really long time. And then when I was at college, he and I would hang out. He was a stud. He had all his girlfriends. We would go to bars, and we'd go in, and he'd stand there. There'd be a big long line of guys, a line of girls standing in line to talk to him, and I'm just sitting off the end and going, okay, well, if any of your cast-offs want to talk to me, I'm fine with that over here, okay? So, but anyway, so Ken calls me up. And so I was in Ken and his wife's wedding as well. So so he calls me up after he's moved out to at the time they were in Woodland Hills, and they just moved from Van Nuys. And so he says, well, there's a position currently open at New World, and they're looking for someone to be an artist. So we need someone who will help us with doing the art for the game. And I said, well, okay. So he'd spent some time teaching me how to do some kind of space art. And so I knew how to use an airbrush, and I could do planets and nebula and crap like that doesn't actually require talent. Because that stuff is easy. But whenever you actually start having to draw things that look like things, it's like, okay, well, I could draw you a person, but they're going to look more like a swamp creature than a human being. And if you want something that actually is going to look like anything, I can do it, but it will take me, what might take you a week will take me 3 months. And as flattered as I am that you are willing to basically bring me out and have me do this, and I'd love to come out there and just hang out with you and work with you, what's ultimately going to happen is they're going to fire me and they're going to fire you. Just because it's going to make you look bad, and I don't want to do that. As much as I'm excited about the idea of coming out and working for a game company, that sounds really cool. I'd seen the movie, War Games, fell in love with Ali Sheedy, and I said, at any cost,
who didn't?
Yeah, I want to be David Lightman so I can date Ali Sheedy, right? And so, but yeah, so I'd gone out. I had my parents bought me an Atari 400 computer. So that was back whenever it didn't even have keys. It had its membrane with it had all the letters on it. And so you're sitting there trying to poke the letters. And of course, you have to basically take a chisel and a hammer to get it to register the keystrokes. But I learned how to program using the Atari 400, and I had the little manuals about how to peek and poke and do assembly language and all that other stuff. I built my own version of Defender, which was the worst version of Defender that you've ever seen in your life. But
if you did that in assembler, that's still impressive.
Actually, that was using peeks and pokes and that kind of stuff. I read assembly language, but I said, "Oh my God, I would probably be better off trying to learn Klingon than this."
That was a long class in college.
That is a very long class in college, and so. Of course, this is pre-C or whatever, so this is sort of basic and basic plus and that kind of crap. So anyway, I had done some of that stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller, I'm a designer. So I have artistic inclinations. Being a programmer is not in my soul. I can do it, but it is with great pain and agony.
God, we are alike. That is so funny.
So anyway, so he's saying, okay, well, so if you don't want to take the art position, I realize I'm all over the place. I'm sorry, guys. I really
Neal, please,
Great.
please.
Great.
This is awesome.
I'm honestly like a jackrabbit on crack. So right.
We are, like I said, we are super chill. Like I'm having a blast.
Okay, good. Well, so anyway, so I said thank you, but no thank you, because like I said, I think it sounds amazing, but I just don't think it's a good idea at the time.
Right.
So I go back to my drudgery at the mail house.
Oh.
And so then about 2 or 3 months later, I get another phone call from Ken. He says, okay. And he says, so here's the deal, is that we have a fellow here that is currently on vacation. He does not know whenever he gets back from vacation, he's no longer going to have a job. And so we need someone who will be a writer 24/7 on salary, writing science fiction and fantasy. Do you want to do?
Oh my God!
So you benefits and all the nice stuff. Do you want to move to California and do this job? And I said, okay. What do you need me to do? I have no idea how to apply for a game design job or whatever.
Right.
And they said, well, we just need a writing sample that you can send to us. Now, what do I have sitting off to the side as a writing sample? I have a stack of audio drama scripts.
Oh, awesome.
And of course, also, like most people my age, I had done quite a bit of role-playing stuff myself, and so I played Dungeons and Dragons on the weekends. My big passion at the time was Call of Cthulhu.
Nice.
Call of Cthulhu is and always will be my favorite role-playing system.
It's so fun.
It's more about storytelling than it is about obscure rules. Like I said, I used to harass people about this. Yes, the great thing about D&D is like, okay, all right, we're in the situation now. I need to find the half-elf spills a lantern on a stairwell table to decide whatever's going to happen. Anyway, so he says, do you want to come out and interview for this? And I said, okay. So I go out and I grab my Uncharted Regions scripts, and I tuck them in an envelope along with, even though I wasn't applying for an art job, I took some pictures of my pictures I had done with an airbrush. I took those in there, and some of my D&D campaign or Call of Cthulhu materials, and I stuffed them in there. And I stuck them all up in an envelope, and I sent it off. And so a couple of days after they got it, they just called me up and say, hey, do you want to fly out for an interview? So, okay. Sure.
Hell yeah.
Okay, so I go out there, and so I'm supposed to meet with John Van Caneghem, who, of course, is the creator of Modern Magic and the head of the company. And so we go out there, and I'm having a great time because I'm staying with Ken and his wife Angie, and I get a chance to meet the boss, and so I'm sitting down with JVC, and I'm extremely nervous, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because JVC is the most unexcitable guy that you could ever possibly imagine.
Really?
Yeah, it's just like you say, JVC, we all call him JVC. He's John Van Caneghem, but we all call him JVC.
Uh-huh.
And say, JVC, I just took an axe and I just killed your entire family, and I've left them in a pool of blood, and they're now being eaten by wild dogs. And JVC's response would be something like, I'm really upset about that. With just the most placid look on his face or whatever. He was just the most chill, mellow guy, because a lot of times he would go out before work, he'd go surfing. He in his spare time, whenever he wasn't making games, his sideline was racing cars, and so he had a race car. And of course, he drove. He would bring in his Boxster or whatever it was that he would bring in. And so anyway, I come in and I do this interview with JVC, and I'm really nervous to the whole thing or whatever. And I get to the end, and so I'm kind of fidgeting, and so I'm like, so. Do you have an idea? I just want to have kind of an idea about, do you know when you might be making a decision? So I have an idea sort of what the time frame is. Oh, well, you're hired.
Oh my God.
Man.
And he said, we just needed to meet you and kind of, meet you face to face and see what you're like. But Ken says you're okay and your qualifications are certainly great. So, you're the only person in the company that has a degree. And so I said, great. And I said, when do I start? And I said, when can you get here? And so I said, well, I'll go back home and pack up. And so I was supposed to be back in 2 weeks.
Wow.
So I go back home and I get my beat up 73 Mustang that my brother gave to me after he got married, and he'd given me his old 73, and this thing was a disaster. It could barely run, but
don't tell me you drove that out to California.
I did. And so I also had my cousin following me because he had a single panel white van, and we put all of the important stuff in his van. And then we put shit like my my toiletries and just random clothes and stuff in my Mustang. And the idea is if the Mustang dies along the way, we just leave it at the road. Trip snowing between here and there, and so we went to Albuquerque, and we were coming up through Albuquerque, and it's holy crap. I hope we don't run into this from but so the trip goes pretty well so I'm driving down the road with this map and basically spread over the steering wheel, looking at it, say, okay, where do we have? I mean, fortunately, it was a pretty easy trip because most of it is just straight down the 40.
Yeah,
and then it's not until you get to San Bernardino until the trip gets weird. So the trip goes pretty well until we finally are pulling into the Los Angeles metro area, and so we've come down the 15 or whatever it was the 40 and then 40 to the 10. I think we're off the 10. We're pulling it at Los Angeles, and of course, I have this. Scale is a new thing for me. Even though I came out on the plane and I interviewed, it wasn't like I spent a lot of time driving around in Los Angeles, and so I still don't have a sense of scale. Dallas at this point is the largest city I've ever been in. Well, take it back. I've been to London, but I hadn't driven around in it.
Right. It's a different story when you're driving. It is a different story when you're driving. And Dallas had been the largest city I've driven around in up to this point. So we get to Los Angeles. It is dark. And so we're driving along, and we're on the 101 freeway, and I see an exit off the 101 freeway where we're in Hollywood, and I see an exit for Ventura Boulevard. I said, "Oh, fantastic! I know that's the building or that's the street where my where New World Computing's offices are. So if I can get to there, I'm pretty sure I can get from there to the apartment." Because I've rented an apartment in the same building as Ken and Angie had a place, simply because that was going to make it easy, and they could recommend, and so they helped me get into that apartment complex by just giving a recommendation, because that's the other thing is getting an apartment in Los Angeles anytime is difficult, and so at least I had people who lived there who could vouch for me. Right. So we get to LA, and so I see the exit for Ventura Boulevard. I said, okay, we're going to get off at Ventura. So we get off the freeway, we roll down to the stoplight, and then this is the first time in miles and miles and miles that my foot has not been on the gas. So I get to the light there, and it's oh no,
and I go, okay, this car is about to die on me. And so this car, the only way that I can keep it functioning is by, when I'm sitting at the stoplight, to have one foot on the brake and the other one on the accelerator to keep the engine from dying. And so, anyway, so we proceed to head down Ventura Boulevard. Now, little country boy me does not understand that Ventura Boulevard is a street that goes through about 10 towns.
I was about to say, which way did you go?
It goes through about 10 towns before
We've been going for a while.
Yes, but so it goes through Hollywood and it goes through all of these other places way the hell before you actually get to Woodland Hills, which is where the office is. So we're cruising down Ventura Boulevard for I don't know how long it was, but I'm fighting this thing at every stoplight, and of course people are just giving us the craziest look. They're looking over at me like, "What kind of wacko are you?" Because this Mustang is just sputtering and shuddering, and I'm just at this point I am so nervous because my hands are just clenched to the steering wheel.
Oh yeah,
I am just so nervous, and of course the other thing too is that this is the era whenever the highway. I don't know if you were old enough to remember, but there were all these shootings that were going on.
Yes.
In LA,
yeah, the highway shooter.
Shooter. So this is that time frame, right?
Oh dear God!
So I'm seeing folks that don't look like people from back home, right? And
my goodness!
And so I'm terrified out of my mind.
Okay, we might have just hit a time limit with Craig, which is no problem. All right, Craig, you keep recording. So, you've made it to New World Computing.
Yes.
What was the first game that you worked on?
So, the first thing that I was assigned to work on at New World was actually kind of a odd thing. When I got there, they had developed there used to be a pen and paper role playing game called Tunnels and Trolls.
Yep.
That was, another one of these. It was very similar to Dungeons and Dragons. There were a whole host of, in the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, there were a whole host of sort of competitors to Dungeons and Dragons, and Tunnels and Trolls was another one of them. It tended to skew towards comedy, and really sort of absurd kind of situations and things. But New World had acquired the rights to develop a computer game version of Tunnels and Trolls. But they didn't develop it initially in-house. They had actually contracted with a company in Japan called, and this has no relation, but a company called StarCraft.
Oh, wow.
And so StarCraft developed this Japanese version of the game. And so whenever I got to New World, the Japanese version of the game had been done, and they needed to basically port it back to a PC format. And so whenever I got there, they handed me this phone book size stack of paper, which was all the dialogue in the game translated from Japanese into English. And so they said,
you had work cut out for you.
And so they said, you need to translate this, this text from the sort of pidgin English into not only something that's understandable, but that actually has some flavor and flair to it.
Functional and
some, and so it's also compelling as well as letting the player know what they need to do. Now the problem is there's nothing that is actually currently running on a PC that I can. It's not like blocks of text are numbered and says this number goes with this window,
right.
Or anything that I can sit down. So what they give me is a Japanese version of the game, and the one thing that I can kind of go by is I can see stats and some other stuff, but otherwise this is completely in Japanese. I do not read or write or speak Japanese. But of course, nowadays, if you're doing something like this, there would be a design document. It would say, here is this level, here is what's supposed to happen in these levels, and you would at least have some context in which various pieces of dialogue will come up. But at this point, design documents are not a thing that are standardized across the industry. And they don't exist at New World. And so I'm taking this phone book sized wad of text and playing the game in Japanese, and then kind of taking these text and kind of figuring out, okay, that has to do with this. And so I would get these wonderful I'd get sentences like, sudden boat turned turtle. And which I would have to say, okay, suddenly the boat turned over.
Oh wow!
And so there's just loads and loads and loads of stuff like this, and so I'm having to like say translate it first into something that makes sense, and then I'm supposed to take my magic prose powers and turn this into readable prose dialogue, and prose and dialogue and stuff like that. So so that's what I spend the first, I think it's 2 months. I think whenever I'm at New World is doing this translation job. Now, so about the time I'm getting done with this, I'm in JVC's office, and I'd gone in to ask him something, but he wasn't there, and so I start to turn around. Of course, his office, he has a lot of classic games, both pen and paper, but also computer games that are in his office. And I'm looking around, and I see there's a tunnels and trolls thing sitting on the shelf. And I said, "Oh, this is kind of cool." And so I pull it out and realize that here is the adventure from which the Japanese have adapted their game. I have just basically rewritten this entire thing that already exists on paper, and nobody.
Oh no!
And so I'm a little freaked out by this because it's just like, holy crap! Couldn't you have told that here between the two and said paste here and this goes here, and I could have created some bridging text and things for in the module, which were never intended, which we're happy with that hint manual, because I wrote it as if it was a tour guide that you would buy to a real place.
That's cool. I loved hint books that did that.
And so it was called Dreams of the Dragon. And so anyway, that was my first kind of experience dealing with my first gig at New World, was doing this absurd sort of translation task. But whenever I got done with that, JVC says, okay, well, the next thing that needs to happen is we got, Might and Magic 1 and 2 were out. They had King's Bounty done, but they needed the manual written for King's Bounty. So, of course, for your listeners, King's Bounty is the game that became Might and Magic Heroes.
Yeah, I had that on Sega. I loved it.
Or Heroes of Might and Magic, I should say. So King's Bounty is, and so I guess, ironically, someone's making King's Bounty 2 now. Apparently, I've seen ads for that.
Sweet.
So presumably separate from the Heroes of Might and Magic stuff. But anyway. So they said, we're working on Might and Magic 3. It's in the pipeline, and so we need you to start working on the story for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I started work on Might and Magic 3, and of course that was at the early stages, it was just basically, what's the overall storyline for this going to be about? And so I pretty much came up with the whole idea of the crashed thing, and there's a spaceship, and it gets submerged, and sort of the overall large plot line for what was going to happen. I worked with JVC on... he was working on a new system for how items and weapons were going to work, and so they would have these attributes, and so you would have, and so I created a little random numbers generator just to kind of have it create different items, just to see what it's going to be like. And so I think the most embarrassing thing is when it came up with a vibrating leather, the vibrating leather buddy rod of aid. Actually, he called it AIDS at the time, not thinking about the disease. And so it had the vibrating leather buddy rod of AIDS, and so, but it was, the whole idea is, you have a property, properties of, here's a material, here is a property, here, and whatever.
It's like a predecessor almost to like Diablo's loot system.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's definitely an early forerunner or something like that. And so I can't take.
Awesome.
can't take credit for that system, but again, I created a random generator just to kind of fiddle with it and see how it was going to work. And so
Sure.
it would populate chests and crap like that. So, meanwhile, as I told you before, is that New World had acquired the rights for basically they bought Task Force Games.
Uh-huh.
And they were wanting to develop Starfleet Battles as a computer game. But whenever they started kind of developing the idea, they said, well, maybe we have something a little more elaborate where we're going to fly around in space and we have all our space battles. And of course, we're looking at Star Control, and we're looking at some of these other things that had the systems that were similar to what we wanted to do with that. But obviously, using rules that are much more closely associated with how Starfleet Battles handle things. But the thing about it is that we had the rights to Starfleet Battles, but we did not have the rights to Star Trek.
I was just about to ask, yeah.
So it's not like we could go out and say this is Federation. This is the rights to for Starfleet Battles is very specific to the game.
Yeah.
And so to a pen and paper, whatever, getting into the kind of game we were working on, we didn't really have the rights to say, this is a Starfleet vessel, this is whatever. So we were going to take the mechanics of Starfleet Battles. That was going to be how space-to-space combat was going to work. Ship-to-ship combat was going to work. But they're talking about the ideas, maybe we would have them beam down and they would do missions and everything else like that. And so I was really excited and intrigued about this idea because, again, I grew up, I was the biggest Star Trek fan in the world growing up. The original Star Trek series was hugely influential to me, and still is. And I really, really wanted it to be sort of driving how the storyline developed with that. And so, but the thing about it is I had the Might and Magic game that was there, Might and Magic 3, and then Planet's Edge, and I said, I'm a brand new starting writer. I do not want to have to tackle both of these simultaneously.
Yeah.
And also Might and Magic, that's the flagship and all this other stuff. And I said, so JVC was going to be doing all of the design for Might and Magic anyway, but so he would basically draw maps and then he would hand it off to other people to implement. And so I'm just looking at this other stuff. I said, Might and Magic doesn't really need me as a designer. And as much as I played like one of the Might and Magic games before I came out, but honestly, I was a lot more familiar. The game that I'd actually spent some time playing with, and it wasn't even my machine, but I'd hang out with a buddy of mine who owned it, was not Fairy Tale, but Bard's Tale.
Oh, yeah.
And so my buddy owned Bard's Tale, and so I would come over, and our Dungeons and Dragons group would actually sit around and sort of group play Bard's Tale.
Yep.
And so even though Might and Magic was a different thing, they're similar enough. If you played Bard's Tale, you understood Might and Magic and vice versa. It's that sort of 2D and a half engine that they had for doing that kind of stuff. But anyway, I said, is Might and Magic 3 would be cool, but I would really like to just go over and work to concentrate full time on Planet's Edge. So I said, so why don't I get you another writer for Might and Magic 3, and I can switch to focusing full time on Planet's Edge. And so what I did is I picked up my phone and I called up Ron Bollinger, who was the guy I started Uncharted Regions with.
Oh, wow.
And so it was just kind of the same kind of thing as, Ron, sent some writing samples and we brought him out. And then Ron was my roommate the whole time I was living in Los Angeles after he moved out. And so he and I split an apartment. We initially had a one bedroom apartment, and I had this crazy bed that I'd swapped my car for after it died, that somebody built himself, and I called it the altar because it sat off the ground about 4.5 feet off the ground, and it had this huge space underneath it. So we had this kind of, it was kind of ridiculous. Ron slept underneath my bed. And so he was sort of the monster that lived under my bed. And so that was our first apartment there at the Fortress Fairmont. And so away for about 6 months. And then after that, the guy who had previously owned and run Task Force Games moved out of an apartment which was on the 3rd floor, and it was a 2-bedroom apartment. And so we took over his place. So Ron got his own place. And so we had the same apartment as where Task Force Games was based for a while. But anyway.
That's a wild coincidence.
It's just all these kind of, this weird stuff. The whole New World age was kind of crazy. But anyway, so I got Ron to come out, and Ron took over writing for Might and Magic 3. Now, of course, Ron and I's desks were right next to each other. And with both Might and Magic 3 and Planet's Edge, we actually both wrote on each other's games whenever because every once in a while they go, I'm stuck, whatever. We would write on each other's games. We didn't give each other credit on each other's games because we both wanted, we sort of felt like each of us wanted to say, I own this one and you own this one. And
I totally get that.
But because, we're both brand new, and so we just wanted it to sort of be our own thing. But that said, is we wrote stuff for each other on each other's titles. If you are playing Might and Magic 3 and you're digging through stuff, there's a whole storyline about Fortahall the Mad.
Wow.
That's my plot line.
I remember that. That's cool.
And so, of course, it's just an anagram of my name. And so a lot of there's a lot of music jokes that, of course, that was a Might and Magic thing. There are a lot of puns.
Oh yeah.
And so a lot of that came from Ron and I sitting at our desks or whatever. And of course, I was really huge into classic rock or whatever. That was my playlist. Ron was a bohemian. He wanted to be Jack Kerouac. And of course, the thing about it is in the long run, I think it's actually a really good thing that Ron came in to take over Might and Magic 3, because I think that the storylines for both Might and Magic, because Might and Magic 3, as well as the Dark Side of Zine duology, those were all Ron. And the thing about Ron is the fact that he had not read Tolkien. He didn't care to read Tolkien. He was not interested in it. And so Ron was definitely on a path of, because he'd sort of say, well, I've got these person that are living out in the desert. I said, no, don't, and whatever. But in the long run, I'm really glad subverted trope that was out there, partially because he just didn't know.
That's awesome.
I would tell him things, we would have conversations about stuff, but Ron did his own thing. And so I was always very happy that Ron did what he did, because I think that honestly, a lot of the more unique twists and things that happened in 3 and 4 and 5 are all thanks to Ron being a nonconformist and not being a hardcore geek. He basically brought in his own view and his own kind of approach to doing stuff. And I think that those 3 games are the better for having that having been true.
And probably, again, the most unique in the series. And that trilogy would be my favorite in that series by far. And that's one of the things, because I was the Tolkien geek growing up. And as soon as I got to like parts like that, I'm like, dwarves in the desert. Yeah, I'm down with that.
And that was just, like I said, at first it kind of drove me a little crazy, because I definitely was the person that knew the fantasy tropes and the sci-fi tropes. But after a while, I just kind of let go and all that other stuff. And I said, he's doing the right thing. He's going off in his right direction, and he's putting his own stamp on it. And in the long run, it was absolutely the right decision. And I'm so happy that I managed to talk him into doing that. Anyway, so I took off on Planet's Edge, and of course we said, so in space it's going to be Eric Hyman, who was the programmer on it. He's the one that implemented all of the space stuff. That was his, and so he was a huge, fan of Wing Commander, and so. So he's like playing Wing Commander pretty much all the time when he was not working on the game. He was playing on Wing Commander, and sometimes he should have been working on the game when he was playing Wing Commander. So it was really the core of that team was myself, Eric Hyman, and Kenneth Mayfield. And Ken was somebody who was also, he was a huge Starfleet Battles player, was into that. So we also had, of course, whenever they bought the company, probably 3 or 4 of the top ranked players of Starfleet Battles were in our company.
Oh, wow.
So these were not people who just basically acquired the company for the hell of it. These were the people who were the best at playing it. And so some nights, after closing hours, there would be a Starfleet Battles tournament going on in the conference room. And these would go on, and of course it was just crazy because if you wanted to learn how to play that game, you'd sit down and just sit back and watch, because there was Ron, not my friend, not my buddy Ron, but there was another Ron. There was Big Ron and there's Little Ron. Big Ron was was the vice principal of the company, and I don't know why I'm blanking on his name now. Ron Spitzer.
Okay.
Ron Spitzer and all these folks would come in. And they have these major Starfleet Battles campaigns going on, and that was like I say, it was kind of fascinating because you watch them have these go, wow, that's a tactic I never would have thought of before. But I mean, they had just hours and hours and hours and hours of tactics under the belt from having played these games. So anyway, Eric Hyman, who was the programmer, he handled all of the programming and basically trying to integrate as many of the Starfleet Battles rules into the space combat as was possible. He also created the sort of resource system. So whenever you were upgrading your ship, you have to have this many metals and all that kind of stuff. That was all Eric. And so once you beamed down, that was my domain. And so my concept is that you fly around in space and you're having space battles, and that's Starfleet Battles. But the moment you beam down, it's every planet is an episode of Star Trek.
Wow.
And so just in terms of sort of the feel of everything. And so every planet was a self-contained sort of episode. And so beginning, middle, end, and there's a whole plot line that would happen on each planet. Then the game was divided up into a number of stars in sort of sectors.
Yeah.
Each sector had a storyline that controlled what was going on in the events of all that sector. And then there was another plot line that united all the sectors together. So there's 3 levels of storytelling that was going on.
Wow.
And so this was all plotted. We had this huge, it was my first chance of really working with a gigantic whiteboard in the conference room. And so I would be in there plotting the stuff out and writing out the plot lines, and it was kind of fun because people would drift in and look at stuff and just kind of being kind of amazed by all the crazy stuff that I was doing with stuff. But the important thing about Planet's Edge is that it is the forerunner of another game we'll be discussing shortly. In terms of, there was a great deal of on-screen text in Planet's Edge. And certainly a lot more than there was in Might and Magic. And the interesting thing was I was having to solve problems by you would have your party that was adventuring around, and you could change different party members to do different things based on their skills and based on what equipment they're carrying. And of course, with Planet's Edge, it was all about the stuff you carried. You were not. It wasn't D&D where you have a set of stats. This is all based on you are simply he who bears this stuff, and right. So this gun has this kind of damage, and this armor has this kind of reflectivity, and there's nothing that's baked into your character itself. Or there's very little, actually. There may have been some. Now that I'm thinking about it, there might have been some base level stuff, but it's not like you're leveling up your character.
Right. Right. The stats stayed relatively the same. I did some reading on that, unless you clone them or something.
Yeah. Well, if you cloned them, and so basically after they died, then you get the clone, but the clone was sort of degraded. Was the idea? Okay. So this was partially from Call of Cthulhu. Where in Call of Cthulhu, you're not somebody. Your sanity's going down,
Right.
and you might gain a few points in one stat or the other, but for the most part, your stats are fairly static, and you don't become living gods in Call of Cthulhu.
No.
Which is something that I actually always preferred. I kind of hated about D&D is the fact that I'm 15th level, and it's just like I'm fighting Anubis.
Yeah, you're just mowing through stuff too.
You're just plowing through people, and it's just I kind of hated that because it's like there's not as much risk on the line, and I like the fact that with Call of Cthulhu, you're always in danger of dying or going batshit crazy. I mean, that was the real thing about Cthulhu is the fact that I love the fact that the most educated people on the party, or the people who have had the most experience, are the ones that are probably your biggest deficit.
Yeah, they're the ones that are going to go nuts first.
They're going to go crazy and maybe kill the rest of the party. And so some of the approach to how we did the gear was based on Call of Cthulhu. Also, another gigantic influence on the systems that we implemented was Traveller, the pen and paper role playing sci-fi game Traveller.
Okay.
And so that was another big influence on Planet's Edge. And so we really took Star Trek, Starfleet Battles, Traveller, and Call of Cthulhu and mixed it in a big vat, and that became Planet's Edge. And Planet's Edge, it was an interesting kind of a process because, like I see, Eric was the programmer, and we didn't really have a lot of let's sit down and talk about how stuff was going to happen. We were all kind of in our own little silos.
Okay.
So I would drop levels, and I would go and drop them on Eric's desk, and then he would, or actually I would give them to Ken, and Ken would start creating all the tiles that would form, all the different areas, and then Eric would go in and do, black box, programming sorcery to make things work. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, we did have other artists that were involved with the project. That would so eventually we had John Gwynn, we had Bonnie Hemseth, who was an artist. We sadly just lost Bonnie just a couple of months back.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, she was a very sweet lady, but she had cancer, and so we lost her a couple of months ago. But we had Lewis Johnson, who was primarily involved with Might and Magic, but he also did some stuff for Planet's Edge. Mm-hmm. Some fun trivia about Planet's Edge. Of course, there were the four main characters that were through the whole thing. The crew of the Ulysses, and the captain is basically John Van Canningem's face.
I was going to say, okay.
So Katja is Angie Mayfield, so Ken's wife. Osai is John Gwynn's wife, and Nelson was one of our artists that was his face, and so all of their faces. Wow. And so if you play any of the Might and Magic games, this was just sort of a New World thing. Is our faces all show up at some point in some of those games.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so my head is in some of the Might and Magic. I think in the later ones, in 4 or 5, I think maybe. But John and I, John is listed in the credits for Planet's Edge. John would basically rubber stamp things.
Uh-huh.
But as far as Planet's Edge goes, it was really Eric and I who did all the design for it. I mean, John is the one who basically sort of gave us, here's the mission, but again, there was no design document for this, and so a lot of this was, I dropped stuff on Eric's list. Now, Eric and I had kind of a big fight in the middle of Planet's Edge because at one point I'd been giving him stuff, and he was busy playing Wing Commander. And so he had like a couple of weeks worth of stuff that I put on his table, and we had a meeting in JVC. We all were having a group meeting, just kind of talk about, where are various things. And Eric kind of threw me under the bus. He said, "Oh, well, I got the stuff and I can't use any of the stuff that you gave me." I said, "I've been dropping this stuff on your desk every day for weeks and you haven't said anything to me." And this was anyway. It was one of those things that really got on my craw, and so Eric and I butted heads some. And towards the end of the project, we weren't really speaking to each other. And so another important person that I need to talk about here, though, is someone who came in between the development of Might and Magic 3 and Planet's Edge. And he was brought in from the recently from Cinemaware, which is also where we got where we got Lewis Johnson from, where we got John Gwynn, who was, like I said, one of our illustrators for, and we got John Cutter.
And I see where we're going.
John Cutter arrived at New World to be a producer, to work on both Might and Magic 3 and on Planet's Edge. And John and I became friends really, really fast. He liked to read stuff. He particularly really liked a lot of this text and the story and stuff I was developing for Planet's Edge. And so we had a lot of kind of discussions about stuff that was going on, and we really bonded really quickly, and he really became my real game design mentor, because even though John Van Canningham, like I say, he was fabulous, I appreciate the opportunity he gave me and giving me the job and just sort of guiding how things happened with everything else. It was really Cutter who basically said, let me teach you how to design games, because John had developed all this great stuff at Cinemaware, and again, he did Wings, which I think is probably still
one of my favorite games of all time.
Yeah, Wings was a fabulous game. He did. It wasn't the Rocketeer, but it was something like Rocketeer. The name of it that was there.
That might have actually. Well, no, it wasn't Rocketeer. You're right.
I can't remember what the name of it was, but he did. He was a producer on, I think, it was either King of Chicago or maybe it was Defender of the Crown.
That's my favorite.
And I think that he might have, and whenever he was at New World, we didn't do the original game, but we did a port of It Came from the Desert.
Oh yes!
And so we did the Amiga port of that, I think, and so John, I think, was also a producer for that.
That's the game. That's the version I played too.
And so anyway, so John and I would spend a lot of time hanging out. So at one point, John got a phone call from Dynamix, which was a company up in Eugene, Oregon, and they were had I think not too much earlier than that had been purchased by another game company that people would recognize called Sierra Online. And so I don't remember exactly how it happened. I think that John Cutter and JVC, I think Cutter just wanted opportunities to do more. He didn't really feel like they were giving him the reins to do as much as he wanted. And so he got a call from Dynamix, and they wanted John. So he took the job up in Dynamix. But before he left, I said, I would really like to come and work with you. Yeah. And I said, so if there's anything, if anything comes up and a job opens up, please give me a call, because I'd really, really like to develop a game with you from the beginning, because John was coming after things were sort of already rolling for stuff. And I said, I'd love to really work with him, because again, just he and I were just so perfectly simpatico. And also the thing is that we both understood what the other person was good at. And we basically said, I'm going to let you do this thing, and you let me do this other thing. And
that's the best working relationship you could ever ask for.
Yeah, and it was just, he and I had such great energy and synergy together. So John got the job at Dynamix, and around the time that we were getting toward the last, we were in the final stages of implementation for Planet's Edge. We were not in final beta testing yet, but we're finishing up. Basically, all the text had been written, the manual had been written. That was another thing where I helped with the manual on Planet's Edge. I really kind of regret the way I did the manual the manual for Planet's Edge, because honestly, I think I got a little too artsy for my own good, and I should have actually explained more about this is what the controls do. Because the manual is a little arcane for most people. Because we sort of were operating under this, well, the controls are fairly self-explanatory. No, they weren't. But I'm young, I'm stupid, okay? I'm 24, right? Anyway, so John calls me up and says, we have from a major New York Times fantasy author. We need a writer that can basically help me develop this, kind of adapt this or whatever. I think you're the only person in the industry that can do it. Honest to God, that's what he said.
That's awesome.
I didn't necessarily believe that, but if that's what he said, sure, okay, I'll take the compliment. And also, the other thing this was a job that would be living in the Pacific Northwest.
And that is definitely more your style.
That is definitely much more my style than Los Angeles with palm trees and traffic jams and just constantly being afraid of everything. Anyway, so that's how the link then happens that takes me to the next stop on our journey.
All right, everybody, that will bring us to the end of our first part of our interview with Neal Hallford. Thank you all for listening, and stay tuned next week where we will get into part 2, which talks about Neal's time at Dynamix, Betrayal at Krondor. We'll get into some of his movie projects. That might be one long episode. We might split it up. I haven't decided yet. I'm still finishing that up. But we really hope you enjoyed our first part of this interview with Neal. And can't wait to see you all back here next week for the next part of our interview with Neal Hallford. Till then, have fun, play games, and don't be dicks.